What's going on, YouTube? This is SG1 Sports, and we're continuing our series here where we look at how teams did in one-possession games last season to see if they were maybe overrated or underrated. And a better way to put that, probably better or worse than their record. And we take a look at the one-score games, see what the teams could have possibly done if they'd won all their one-possession games or if they lost all their one-possession games. We did this with the SEC and the Big Ten. We'll finish up with the Big 12 and the Pac-12. If you missed those videos, go back and check them out. It doesn't tell the whole story always, but sometimes you can learn a little bit from this, and you can see which teams maybe were a little bit better or worse than their record would suggest, or maybe they were actually overrated or underrated. Going back to 2020, this is what we saw that season, and you see the record in one-possession games. How about Miami, 3-0? Maybe they were overrated a little bit. That played out that way exactly in 2021. It did not play out that way for NC State, though. They were 3-1 in one-possession games, but they actually had a really good year this past season. And you're seeing the teams kind of in a different order here, because if you remember in 2020, for one thing, Notre Dame was in the ACC, and there were no divisions. So that's why you're seeing the teams all mixed up. The other teams you see here, how about Louisville? They were 3-6 in one-possession games. Almost every game they played was a one-possession game. Georgia Tech had a bunch of them. Florida State was 0-2, perhaps telling you that they were underrated a little bit, and they did bounce back this year, not quite to the level that I think Seminole fans were hoping, but they did have a better season in 2021, and we'll see if that trend continues. So now we're going to look at each division here in 2021, starting with the Atlantic Division. You see the records. Of course, Wake Forest won this division. These are the overall records, not the conference records. And NC State was there at 9-3. Clemson, of course, a big surprise with 3 losses. Louisville was 6-6. Florida State, Boston College, Syracuse, those are the overall records. How are these teams in one-possession games? Well, Wake Forest was 3-1. 3-1. So they were fortunate to go 10-2. It could have very easily been a 9-3 season for them, or even an 8-4 season. NC State, once again, had a winning record in one-score games. They were 3-2, so they've done it now 2 years in a row. Clemson was 3-2 in one-score games. You don't normally see Clemson having 5 one-possession games during a season. That shows you how crazy this year was. Louisville was 2-3. Once again, they had a pretty good amount of one-score games, and that's been the story for Louisville the last few years. Florida State had 7 of them. They were 3-4, so almost every game that they played was a close game. Boston College was 1-2. Syracuse was 2-3. So if these teams had won all of their one-possession games, Wake Forest, NC State, and Clemson, their best case scenario for 2021 would have been 11-1. All 3 of these teams had a chance to go 11-1 and would have possibly been playoff contenders going into the ACC championship. I think Clemson would have been, especially if that one loss had come to Georgia. I don't know about NC State and Wake Forest, but they would have at least been in that conversation. Louisville and Florida State both could have gone 9-3. Could have been much different years for them. Boston College could have been 8-4. So could Syracuse. Syracuse could have been 8-4 as well. So you see what the seasons could have looked like for these teams. But how about the flip side of that? What if they had lost all of their one-score games? Well, Wake Forest would have been 7-5. So we're talking about a 10-2 team that was close to going 7-5 if they lose their close games. NC State would have been 6-6. Clemson would have been 6-6. These teams, as bad as a 9-3 year for Clemson was, they were not that far away from going 6-6 or even 7-5 or 8-4 with all their one-score wins. Louisville could have been 4-8. Florida State could have been 2-10. Boston College 5-7. Syracuse 3-9. So if we average it all out to see what their records would have been if they split their one-score games, Wake Forest would have been 9-3. NC State and Clemson would have been 8.5 and 3.5. I know you can't have a half a game, but we're doing the averages here. Louisville and Boston College actually both would have been ahead of Florida State, which is interesting. And Syracuse and Florida State would have had the same record at 5.5 and 6.5. So when you look at the Atlantic Division, I think the one takeaway you can get here is Wake Forest. Maybe Wake Forest wasn't quite as good as the 10-2 record. Yes, they had a great year. They deserved to win the Atlantic Division. Good team. But when you saw them kind of get blown out against Clemson, you knew that this was not a team that's on that elite level just yet. They were fortunate to go 10-2, but hey, give them credit. They won those close games. They did what they had to do to win this division. Great season for them. But if you look at the big picture here, was Wake Forest really as good as some of the other 10-2 teams? Maybe some of them there were. Maybe some of them there were. Some of them they weren't. But yeah, that's really the only takeaway here. Everyone else just was close to 500. They were either one game above or half a game below, whatever, from being 500 in those one-score games. So Wake Forest, the only takeaway in the Atlantic Division. And if they lose a couple of those one-score games, NC State or Clemson could have had a chance to win this division. In the Coastal Division, Pittsburgh finished 10-2, Miami 7-5, Virginia Tech and Virginia and North Carolina, 3 teams all 6-6, Georgia Tech 3-9, Duke 3-9. Let's look at the one-score games. And for Pittsburgh, 2-2 in one-possession games. Miami had 8 of them. They were 5-3 in one-score games. It could have been, look, it started off bad for Miami. They were able to rally and win some big games and win some close games. But if they had not won some of those games, it could have been a much different season. Perhaps that's why Manny Diaz was fired. But 5-3 for Miami. Virginia Tech was 2-4. They really struggled in the one-score games. Virginia was very good, 3-1. North Carolina 2-3. Remember a couple of years ago, they had a ton of one-score games, lost a ton of one-score games. They have not seemed to kind of flip that around just yet. Georgia Tech 1-4, terrible record in the one-score games, and Duke was 1-2. If they had won all of their one-score games, how about Pittsburgh? Pittsburgh would have been 12-0. This team would have been undefeated. They would have been probably in the college football playoff. They lost 2 very close games, and that ultimately cost them an undefeated season, but they were not that far away. Pitt was the real deal. I don't think you can say that this team was overrated. Maybe you can for Miami, though, but even if they had won those 3 one-score games that they lost, they would have been 10-2. The problem is, when you look at Miami, they had 5 one-score wins. So if you're expecting them to go 8-0 in one-possession games, I mean, that's just not going to happen. So theirs is maybe not quite as realistic, but it could happen. I mean, Nebraska went 0-8 in one-score games, so maybe you could go 8-0 in one-score games. Virginia Tech would have been 10-2. Much different season for them. Much different season for them. And maybe they keep their head coach. Virginia could have been 7-5. North Carolina could have been 9-3, a team that had a lot of preseason hype. If they win some of these close games, yeah, they could have gone 8-4, 9-3. It wouldn't have been quite as bad of a year. Georgia Tech could have been 7-5. They could have been to a bowl game, and then Duke, they could have been 5-7, so it could have been a little bit better. But how about if these teams had lost all of their one-score games? Pittsburgh would have been 8-4. Still, actually, kind of about what most people probably predicted for Pitt, 8-4, 9-3 type season. So that's what it would have been if they had lost all of their one-score games. Miami could have been 2-10. So that's what I'm talking about here. When you look at Miami and that 7-5 record, and you say, yeah, they had a pretty good year. Well, it could have been better. They could have won more games, some close games. But it could have been a disaster. They could have been 2-10. And early on, it looked like they were headed towards maybe not a 2-10 record, but it looked like it was going to be maybe a losing season. So give them credit for winning those close games, but could have been much, much different. Virginia Tech could have been 4-8. Virginia could have been 3-9. North Carolina could have been 4-8. Georgia Tech and Duke could have been 2-10, just like Miami. But it's interesting that Virginia Tech and Virginia and North Carolina, all of their worst-case scenarios are actually better than Miami's worst-case scenario. But Pitt was clearly the best team in this division. And if you look at what if these teams had split their one-score games, Pitt still would have been 10-2, wouldn't have changed anything. Miami would have dropped down to 6-6. Virginia Tech 7-5. So based off of this, Virginia Tech might have even been a better team than Miami. I'm not necessarily saying that, but that's what the numbers would suggest. Virginia would have been 5-7. North Carolina would have been actually ahead of Miami and Virginia with 6.5 wins. Georgia Tech 4.5 wins, and Duke 3.5. So you can see how things could have been much different with the Coastal Division. One thing was clear: Pittsburgh was the best team, and I think there was really no argument about that. They clearly won this division. They were head and shoulders above everyone else, but below them, it could have been a much different look in these standings if some of these one-score games had gone differently. Miami maybe overrated a little bit, or at least not as good as their record would suggest. Virginia Tech maybe better than their record would suggest. Virginia maybe overrated a little bit. Maybe Georgia Tech was underrated. So looking at 2022, maybe Georgia Tech, maybe they move up a little bit in these standings. Maybe Virginia Tech has a bounce back here. Maybe Miami doesn't have the big year that a lot of us expect them to have. It doesn't tell the whole story, like I said, and you have new rosters and things are changing, so you can't read too much into this, but it's always interesting to look at, and there are a lot of times in the past where you could look at this and see which team was maybe going to have a better season or a worse season the next year based off of these one-score games. So interesting to look at. Your thoughts on the ACC, give them to me down in the comments below. Thanks for watching this video, and stay tuned for more here on the SG1 Sports YouTube channel.